Clinical human maturity develops through one mechanism and one mechanism only: repeated, sustained professional presence in clinical environments where the realities of healthcare practice are normal, and where you are required to meet those realities professionally every single day, regardless of how you feel about them. You cannot read your way into that. You cannot take courses and get your way into it. You cannot shadow across 40 hours into it. You develop it by showing up every day until the things you initially made you uncomfortable become normal. That is what a year as a rehab aide gives you. And for the next few minutes, I want to show you specifically what that development looks like and why it changes your application completely. Because what clinical work actually develops is not just observation hours and a new letter writer. It develops something committees are trying to find evidence of in every application and finds it very rarely: clinical identity. Physical comfort in clinical environments, the ability to be present with full physical reality of human illness, injury, and disability without your discomfort becoming a clinical liability. Bathing, dressing, wound care, bodily functions, these become normal, not because they stop being real, but because professional presence becomes your default. Therapeutic use of self, the beginning of understanding that how you show up, your presence, your communication, your ability to build genuine therapeutic relationships is in itself a clinical tool. Feedback, receptivity, the ability to receive clinical feedback about your clinical performance and use it to improve rather than defend against it. This is one of the most important professional competencies in healthcare, and it develops through practice in clinical environments where feedback is constant. Professional peer maturity, the ability to function as a professional colleague in a team environment rather than a student who needs managing. And here is the specific clinical reality that most pre-OT content completely avoids naming directly. And it's that your year of clinical work will require you to develop professional maturity around. This is the clinical topic that produces the most discomfort in the least experienced applicants. It is also one of the most important clinical areas in OT practice. Spinal cord injury, traumatic brain injury, multiple sclerosis, these conditions can affect sexual function and intimate relationships. Clients need to know that their clinician can discuss these topics professionally without making them feel ashamed for having these needs. An OT who cannot have this conversation professionally is not providing complete care. Developing the professional maturity to engage with this topic requires exposure to clinical environments where it's discussed professionally normally. Rehabilitation settings, spinal cord programs, long-term care. The discomfort you feel understanding this information right now can tell you something. It tells you whether your clinical maturity development needs focus. Now here's where all the clinical development shows up in an application in a way that changes how committees read your file completely. The applicant who spent a year in clinical work writes observation descriptions that sound completely different than any other application. They do not just describe what OT did, they describe what happened between the OT and the patient. They notice the therapeutic relationship. They observe the communication. They reflect on how the therapist's presence affected the clinical moment. That reflection demonstrates the beginning of therapeutic use of self, and it is visible to a committee immediately. The letter from a clinical supervisor who observed you in a healthcare environment after the previous application is worth more than any credential from any professor. That letter answers questions to committees most urgently need answered. Is this person ready for what clinical training requires? And here is the documentation practice that turns your year of clinical development into application evidence. Because experience without documentation is experience that committees cannot see. Keep a clinical reflection journal throughout your development year. Weekly entries. 3 questions every entry. What clinical reality did I encounter this week that challenged me or required me to grow professionally? How did I respond in the moment? What did that response tell me about where I am in my development? What do I understand now about OT practice or about myself as a future clinician that I did not know before? Those entries become the raw material for every piece of your application. Your personal statement is built from the insight in those entries. Your interview preparation is built from the specific moments documented in those entries. Your letter writer briefings reference the specific growth documented in those entries. Documentation transforms lived experience into demonstrable professional development. And demonstrable professional development is what a reapplication needs to show. The year you spend developing clinical maturity is not a delay in your OT journey. It's the beginning of it. And the applicant who arrives to the OT school having spent a year in clinical work is not just a stronger applicant than the one who applied without that experience. They're a better clinician from the first day they start their fieldwork. They arrive having already been required to develop professional presence that clinical training demands. The rejection that brought you here may be the most professionally valuable thing that happened to you. Not because the rejection is good, but because what you do with it determines the kind of clinician you're going to become. If you want more information with this content about how to reapply successfully, come join our school community called OT Student Leveled Up. If you want help specifically on your application, you can join one of my sessions specific to pre-OT applicants.